Hello everybody and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to finally begin discussing World War II. World War II, as many of you would know, it was one of the most single global transformative events in human history, and we still, to a very large degree, still live with the social, military, and economic ramifications of World War II. But before we begin discussing World War II, and it will take about 10 lectures for us to cover all of the major events from the United States perspective of World War II. It will take about 10 lectures before we wrap everything up. But before we begin that, I just like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture, we wrapped up our discussion on the Great Depression. We did our analysis of the Great Depression. We rehashed the ideas, the successes, and the failures of the first and the second New Deal. We also discussed, once again, President Franklin Roosevelt's plan to pack the Supreme Court, the court packing scheme, in which he sought to add to the number of Supreme Court justices. He wanted to increase it from 9 to 15. He wanted to add a new justice for every justice that was over the age of 70. And this wasn't done to lighten the load, to make it dispensing their duties more easier for those justices who were over the age of 70. This was done to ensure that he had six votes in his hand that would support his New Deal initiatives. And that, of course, was thwarted when Justice Owen Roberts, in an effort to preserve the sanctity of the court, the impartiality of the court, just decided to start voting in agreement with New Deal measures. Before Justice Roberts, the New Deal measures had mostly failed on a 5-4 decision, and the four justices who refused to compromise at any length were branded the four horsemen of reaction, and they held firm in their opposition until they slowly began to die off and retire. And of course, the Depression itself, we wrapped up our thoughts on the Depression. Not singling out any one event has the major catalyst that spawned the Depression conditions, but rather we came to the conclusion that it was a coalescing of a multitude of social and economic ills that were not addressed, that led to the Depression and that continued the Depression. We saw that disaster policies in 1931, 1932, the decision to tax in an effort to balance out the budget on Hoover's part, stifled his measures. We saw that some of the main programs of the first New Deal stifled recovery efforts on his own, and it wasn't until the court struck down some New Deal laws that the economy recovered. And then we saw that Roosevelt himself sort of shot the second New Deal in the foot and reversed policies, leading to a return to depression/recession conditions before the troubles of 1939. And with that being said, let's dive right into looking at World War II. And leading into World War II, we're still good because the United States was still in the midst of the Depression. Has World War II, has the world heated up for a hot war? Has the political atmosphere heated up in the anticipation of a hot war? And the United States was still coming out of the Depression. We're still in the shadow of the Depression. So, at least for the opening notes for World War II, I'll still discuss the Depression. And with that being said, let me dive right back into it and say that the Depression, we have seen, had a terrible effect on the United States and the global economic community's health at large. The Depression had a particularly devastating impact on the great industrialized nations of the early 20th century, France, Germany, etc. The economic upheaval led to political catastrophe in many European nations as they grappled with overcoming the Depression. The Spanish and Italian governments fell under fascist regimes under Francisco Franco and Benito Mussolini, while the German government fell to the Nazi regime under Adolf Hitler. Adolf, both pronunciations are used. The post-war settlement under the Treaty of Versailles, coupled with the breakdown of the global economic community, impeded the development of German democracy under the Weimar Republic. Weimar. It was the government that succeeded the Hohenzollern German Empire after the abdication of Kaiser Wilhelm. After he abdicated his positions as the German Emperor and the Prussian King, he was his abdication was followed by a multitude of revolutions in which all the other crown heads of Germany, all the other German princes were forced to they were forced off their thrones. Many of I shouldn't say many, I should say all of them never renounced their rights. Kaiser Wilhelm, when he abdicated with the thought that he was only losing the German imperial title. He would retain his Prussian kingship, and with it all the powers within the German constitution of the Prussian kingship. And at the time of his abdication, it was thought that another Hohenzollern would simply take over the imperial title, and the Prussian royal title will be united later on down the line. That it would simply be Kaiser Wilhelm wouldn't be the emperor, but another Hohenzollern might be the emperor. Max of Baden made he was at that point one of the major German political figures. There were talks that he might take the imperial crown, but the German revolutions wiped all that out. The German monarchists were deprived of their princely titles, and in many cases of their castles, of all their castles, all their property. And the Weimar Republic came into power, but the Weimar Republic never had sound legal footing. The Weimar Republic got the blame for the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, that hated treaty that did nothing but provide the fuel for the Nazi regime. The Nazis, we shall see, Adolf Hitler made it very clear that he did not respect the Weimar Republic, that he did not respect the Treaty of Versailles. And these fascist governments, the governments in Spain, Italy, and Germany, they were headed by dictators. By no way can we discount that those three men, Hitler, Franco, Mussolini, were not dictators. They were dictators who embraced militarism and advocated foreign conquest and espoused authoritarian ideas. Now, Europe was not the only place that the Depression affected the national governments. In Japan, the imperial government embraced militaristic ideologies. They embraced them to the point that they embarked on a series of martial conquests, a series of military conquests, most notably in Manchuria, and most infamously in the Korean Peninsula. The Korean Peninsula was invaded and taken by the Japanese in the early 20th century, and there were very, very hard feelings, still very hard feelings between the two over that. Well, really between the three, the Chinese and the Koreans both have hard feelings over Japanese invasions in the early 20th century. The Italians, not to be outdone by the Japanese, and still smarting over their defeat in the first Italo-Ethiopian War that largely ended with the victory of Menelik II at Adwa they invaded Ethiopia for a second time with the hopes of making imperial conquest. Now, to make matters worse, each regime justified their action through the use of eugenics and eugenic programs, scientific racism, which manifested into some of the worst cases of human rights abuses and genocide, with millions of Ethiopians perishing under the Italian invasion, millions of Chinese and Koreans dying under the Japanese, and millions of Slavs, homosexual Jews, and Roma. Often referred to as gypsies, were killed under the Nazis in Germany. The global struggle against these regimes, which the United States belatedly joined in 1941 after the attack on Pearl Harbor, was in part justified as a crusade for global democracy and racial/ethnic tolerance. Now, for all of the ingenious innovations of the New Deal, it has largely failed to end the Great Depression. The Great Depression was overcome by the national military buildup by United States militarism in preparation for the outbreak of war and the realignment of domestic industries to the war effort. Basically, the United States simply started spending a lot on military preparation. It brought men into the armed forces. They commissioned new fleets. They directed national industries, that giant oil industry, the automobile industry, steel industry. As we have seen in previous lectures, the steel industry was largely directed towards railroad making, and then train making, and then automobile making, and now it's being directed into military vehicles, war tanks, and military ships. And of course, because oil and gas were becoming lubricants and fuel, those industries were being directed towards it. The rubber industry, all of the tying industries that grafted onto the automobile and the locomotive, the train, the railroad industry, they all became firmly aligned with this military buildup. Likewise, radios and the burgeoning Hollywood industry. There would be this unspoken and unabashed sort of militarism within all aspects of United States society. Has all of these industries sort of fell under the purview of sort of breaking of sort of the government's build up to break the Depression and to ensure that the United States will be on a solid military footing for in the event of war. Now, the United States government was spending money on a never before seen or heard of scale. Federal spending dwarfed spending on dwarf military spending during the Civil War or the New Deal programs. With the revitalization of heavy industry, the employment rate fell. It fell to under 10% for the first time in a decade. The recovery did not extend equally to all segments of the population. The African American population, for example, African American community, which had been the first fired when the economy tanked, was now seeming to be the last hired as the economy recovered. Roosevelt, as we have noted, had a very shaky civil rights record. A. Philip Randolph, the leader of the largest African American trade union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, rose to address the economic inequity. They did this large and gaping inequality. Taking a page out of the book of the Bonus Marchers, Randolph planned and organized a march on Washington, D.C. The mass demonstration against racial inequality during a war against multiple discriminatory regimes were meant to embarrass Roosevelt and really to spur him to action. Now, Randolph's ploy worked. The day before the march was set to take place, Roosevelt issued an Executive Order 8002, banning discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. Now, to support the order, Roosevelt created the Fair Employment Practices Committee, the FEPC, within the Office of Production Management, which had helped oversee, which had been created to help oversee the wartime economy. Now, like the New Deal, both measures failed to really accomplish their mission. The FEPC lacked any real authority to resolve the cases brought forward. More than 2/3 of the cases went unresolved. The later increase in African American workers was really attributed to the later desperate need to produce more armaments and the massive increase in military personnel than to the efforts of the FEPC. Moreover, the same social backlash that curtailed African American advancement during the Great Migration and World War I appeared again. The migration of African Americans out of the South, the rural Southeast, what is known as the Second Great Migration, increased during this time as well. More and more flocked up to northern cities, to northern, western, and midwestern cities. They were on the one hand seeking access to these new industrial jobs. The increase in competition for jobs and housing ignited ethnic tensions. The tensions led to over 45 riots in 1943 alone. And the worst of which, of these 1943 race riots, were what was the Detroit riot of 1943, which left 34 people dead. Now, the declaration of war against Nazi Germany emboldened African American leaders to embark on the Double V campaign to defeat fascism abroad and racism at home. They were quick to illustrate the glaring similarities between Nazi anti-Semitism and American Jim Crow. Membership in the anti-discriminatory organizations exploded. The NAACP grew from 40,000 members in 1940 to 450,000 in 1945. New organizations were founded, as well as Randolph in 1942 founded CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, an organization that took a more militant stance than all of the previous civil rights organizations. With the exception of the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was headed by Marcus Garvey. I think that up until the Black Panthers and the Nation of Islam, that organization was the most militant organization. But CORE was the more militant organization compared to the NAACP. It still is. CORE eschewed lobbying and the legal tactics to bring about equality. They opted for direct confrontations, such as sit-ins and street protests. And those two, the sit-ins and the street protests, they would set a pattern for the later civil rights activists. CORE had a great effect on the local businesses in Washington, where a picket campaign got the businesses to integrate. Foreigners also began to examine the problem of race relations in the United States. In 1944, Gunnar Myrdal released his academic study on racial relations in American Dilemma, the Negro Problem and Modern Democracy. Now, had the United States entered World War II, military leadership faced the daunting task of mobilizing manpower, resources to defeat the Axis powers of Nazi Germany, fascist, the Black Shirts was Mussolini's group in Italy, and Imperial Japan. Prior to the war, expectations were that African Americans were to fulfill menial roles in support and supply. Messman Dory Miller, his career exemplified the mixed experience of African Americans during World War II. Miller was initially ineligible for combat training, but during the attack on Pearl Harbor, he shot down at least 2, if not more, Japanese fighter planes. He was portrayed by Cuba Gooding Jr. in the movie Pearl Harbor. He simply heard the call to action. But the United States Navy, it initially ignored Miller's heroism. But he was awarded the Navy Cross after extensive campaigning by the African American press. African American news outlets did not let up on his achievement. They did not fail to inundate the Navy with the reports of what Miller had done. The United States Navy was still slow to promote African American sailors, and as a matter of fact, when Miller's ship, the USS Lipscomb Bay, was sunk a year after Pearl Harbor, he was still a messman. He was still in the same rank that he had been in during the attack on Pearl Harbor. Now, the Navy had been integrated since the 19th century due to the close quarters, but it did not commission an African American officer until 1944. Miller was eventually awarded a medal for his heroism during the attack on his attack during Pearl Harbor. He was given the Navy Cross. Now, the United States Army was a bit quicker to react to the new social atmosphere. In 1941, the United States Army integrated its officer candidate school, and by the summer of 1944 had integrated transportation and recreational facilities. Though prohibited, discrimination still sometimes reared its ugly head, mainly in the Southeast, and in one telling instance, a new recruit in Texas refused to move to the back of the bus, which led to a court-martial. Now, the soldiers, his name was Jackie Robinson, and he would become the man who would later go on to integrate Major League Baseball. The court-martial was later thrown out, and he was not. The court-martial charges were later dismissed, and he was not thrown out of the army. But the wartime necessity to meet the threat to fight in Europe, slowly brought about integrated unions, units, and integrated fighting, in which units of different ethnicities would fight together in the same battle, and this would be something that would first occur. It was something that fell out in the years between the Spanish-American War and World War II. We didn't see a lot of integrated fighting in the Philippines. We didn't see a lot of integrated fighting in World War II. But we did see integrated fighting, units of different ethnicities fighting together during the Battle of the Bulge, and in a very telling sort of moment. Racial segregation, racially segregated units were really only between African Americans and all other ethnicities. Japanese Americans, for example, fought in European American units. Native Americans were integrated with European American units. It was really just African Americans, and even Asian Americans and Native Americans, they were not integrated with African American units. So that's one of the sort of hard truths, harsh observances with the United States military and segregation. But we'll break here, and we'll come back with part 2 of our discussion, our purview of World War II.